Boston had been drowning in cold rain for almost a week when Nick Walker finally admitted he was running out of options. The 31-year-old mechanic stood inside his garage late one evening, staring at the nearly empty customer parking area, while the old radiator beside his desk made clicking noises that sounded like it might die at any second. Business had been getting worse for months, and every bill on his desk carried the same warning in red letters. Late payment. Final notice. Immediate attention required. Nick rubbed both hands over his face, grease still clinging to his fingers after a 12-hour shift, then looked up toward the narrow staircase leading to the tiny apartment above the garage. One extra room. That was all he had left to sell. The next morning he printed a simple ad at the public library. Small furnished room for rent. Utilities included. Walking distance from the subway. Affordable. He almost laughed while typing the word affordable because nothing in Boston felt affordable anymore, especially not for a mechanic trying to keep a dying garage alive. But he posted the ad anyway and forgot about it for 3 days. Then the rainstorm came. It was nearly 10 at night when someone knocked on the garage door. Nick had already locked the front office and was halfway through closing the shop when he heard it again. Louder this time. He walked over with annoyance already written across his face, expecting another drunk college kid asking for directions or some impatient customer wanting their car early. Instead, he found a tall young man standing under the broken garage light with a suitcase in one hand and a dark backpack hanging from one shoulder. His brown coat was soaked from the rain, strands of dark hair stuck against his forehead, and despite trying to look calm, he seemed exhausted in a way that went deeper than simple tiredness. "You still renting the room?" the stranger asked quietly. Nick looked him up and down for a second. The guy looked young, maybe 23 or 24, definitely a student, but not the loud, irresponsible type Nick usually associated with the university crowd nearby. There was something too careful about him, too controlled. "You came at 10 p.m. during a storm to ask that?" "The subway stopped running because of flooding." The young man shifted his suitcase slightly. "I didn't really have another place to go tonight." Nick sighed. "Name?" "Aaron Hayes." "You in school?" "Master's program. Industrial design." Nick opened the garage door wider with a tired shrug. "Come inside before you drown." The apartment above the garage was small, old, and permanently smelled faintly like coffee and engine oil. The couch had a tear in one armrest, the kitchen light flickered sometimes, and the spare bedroom barely fit a twin-sized bed and a desk pushed against the wall. Nick expected Aaron to look uncomfortable the second he stepped inside. Instead, the younger man quietly looked around like the place was somehow peaceful. "It's nice," Aaron said softly. Nick almost snorted. "You don't gotta lie." "I'm not." That answer caught him off guard. While Nick explained the rent and house rules, Aaron listened carefully without interrupting once. "No parties. No smoking inside. Don't touch the tools downstairs unless invited. Pay rent on time. Simple stuff." Most students argued or negotiated. Aaron just nodded seriously at every sentence. Then Nick noticed something strange. The kid's clothes were simple but not cheap. The watch on his wrist looked expensive even though Aaron kept trying to hide it under his sleeve, and his voice carried the kind of polished confidence people usually learned growing up around money. Even the way he stood felt different from everyone Nick knew. "You sure you can afford this place?" Nick asked bluntly. Aaron hesitated just a little too long. "Yeah, I can." Nick didn't push further. Everyone hiding in Boston was running from something anyway. The first week felt awkward. Aaron left early every morning for classes and spent most nights at the kitchen table working on his laptop surrounded by notebooks and design sketches. Nick barely spoke beyond short conversations about groceries or bills, but slowly the silence between them stopped feeling uncomfortable. One night Nick came upstairs after closing the garage and found Aaron asleep at the kitchen table with headphones still on and pencil marks across one hand. His laptop screen displayed complicated 3D design models Nick couldn't even begin to understand. Empty coffee cups surrounded him. Nick stood there for a second longer than necessary. The kid looked different while sleeping. Less guarded. Younger. Without thinking too much about it, Nick grabbed the blanket off the couch and draped it carefully over Aaron's shoulders before turning off the kitchen light. The next morning he found fresh coffee already waiting for him. Things slowly changed after that. Aaron started helping around the garage in small ways at first. He reorganized the front office because the customer layout made no sense. He redesigned the faded garage logo during one of his study breaks and showed Nick a cleaner modern version that somehow still looked exactly like the old shop people in the neighborhood remembered. Then he made social media accounts for the business. Nick laughed the first time he saw Aaron recording a short video of an engine repair with dramatic music playing in the background. "You serious with this?" "Trust me," Aaron said while editing clips on his phone. "People online love this kind of stuff." 3 days later, the video hit almost 50,000 views locally. By the end of the month, new customers started appearing almost daily. "You the owner from those videos?" one customer asked excitedly while pointing at Nick. Nick stared across the garage toward Aaron, who immediately looked away pretending to organize paperwork. That night, Nick bought pizza for both of them without saying why. Aaron smiled harder than he probably realized. The more time they spent together, the more Nick noticed strange contradictions about him. Aaron clearly came from money. He knew expensive wine brands but had never used a laundromat before. He spoke casually about architecture in Italy and hotels in Tokyo, yet looked genuinely proud the first time he successfully changed brake pads by himself downstairs. Nick also noticed Aaron never talked about family. Not once. Whenever his phone rang with certain calls, his entire expression changed. His shoulders tightened, his voice became cold and formal, and afterward he always looked emotionally drained for hours. One particularly bad night, Nick came upstairs around midnight and found Aaron sitting alone on the apartment staircase outside the back door, while freezing rain hit the alley behind the garage. "You trying to get pneumonia?" Nick muttered. Aaron quickly wiped at his face before looking up. "Couldn't sleep." Nick sat beside him anyway. For a while neither spoke. Cars hissed through wet streets nearby while rain tapped softly against metal fire escapes. Then Aaron suddenly laughed under his breath. But there was nothing happy about the sound. "My mother just asked if I was still planning to grow out of this phase before graduation." Nick frowned slightly. "What phase?" Aaron stared out into the rain for several seconds before answering. "Wanting my own life." Something about the way he said it hit harder than Nick expected. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just exhausted. Nick leaned back against the wall. "Parents always think they know better. You close with yours?" "Nah." Nick rubbed his jaw slowly. "Not anymore." Aaron glanced toward him carefully but didn't ask questions. Nick appreciated that more than he could explain. The next few days felt different after that conversation. Softer somehow. Aaron started waiting downstairs after classes just to sit near Nick while he worked. Sometimes he'd sketch designs quietly in the corner office while Nick repaired engines nearby, both existing comfortably in the same silence. Other times Aaron asked questions about cars he clearly didn't understand simply because he liked hearing Nick explain things. Nick caught himself looking for him constantly, listening for his footsteps upstairs, noticing when the apartment felt too quiet. Then came the blackout. A transformer exploded somewhere nearby during another storm, cutting electricity across half the neighborhood. The garage lost power instantly, leaving the apartment dark except for rain flashing against windows from distant lightning. "Great," Nick muttered while digging through drawers for candles. Aaron disappeared into the storage closet for almost 20 minutes before returning with something in his hands. Nick froze when he realized what it was. His old radio, the dusty broken one sitting untouched on a shelf for years. "You fixed it?" Nick asked quietly. Aaron looked suddenly nervous. "I got bored during the blackout." Then he pressed the power button. Static crackled briefly before soft music finally filled the apartment. Nick actually stopped breathing for a second. That radio had belonged to his younger brother. After the accident, Nick had tried fixing it himself dozens of times before finally giving up. Hearing it work again after all these years felt like someone reaching into his chest and pulling old memories back to life. Aaron noticed the look on his face immediately. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. I should have asked before touching it. But Nick shook his head. No, he said quietly, still staring at the radio. It's okay. For a long moment neither moved. Then Nick looked up and found Aaron already watching him. Not casually. Not politely. The kind of look that lingered too long. The kind that made Nick suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the candlelit apartment while rain hammered against the windows outside. Aaron looked away first. Later that night, after Aaron finally went to bed, Nick sat alone in the kitchen listening to the repaired radio play softly beside him. For the first time in years, the apartment above the garage didn't feel empty anymore. Winter settled over Boston faster than either of them expected. By early December, the streets around the garage were covered in dirty snow. Customers stomped melted ice across the shop floor all day long, and Nick's ancient heater rattled so loudly upstairs that Aaron joked it sounded like the building was trying to die dramatically. But somehow, despite the freezing weather and constant work, life inside the garage apartment started feeling warmer. Aaron became part of Nick's routine so naturally that neither of them noticed it happening at first. Nick would wake up before sunrise and find coffee already brewing because Aaron stayed up late working on his thesis anyway. Aaron would come downstairs after class and automatically grab tools or organize invoices without being asked. They started eating dinner together almost every night, usually cheap takeout balanced on their knees while watching random late-night television from opposite ends of the couch that somehow kept getting less distant every week. The garage itself slowly came back to life too. Aaron's videos online kept growing, especially the ones focused on Nick restoring old engines while explaining repairs in his rough Boston accent. Customers now specifically requested the mechanic from TikTok, which annoyed Nick so much that Aaron laughed about it constantly. You know people think you're attractive, right? Aaron said one night while editing a new video at the kitchen table. Nick nearly choked on his beer. What? The comments. Aaron turned the laptop slightly toward him. Look. Nick immediately regretted looking. Half the comments had nothing to do with cars anymore. Hot mechanic could ruin my life, honestly. Why is the grumpy one kinda? Sir, respectfully, please lean over the engine again. Nick stared at the screen in horror while Aaron completely lost control laughing. This is your fault, Nick muttered. Aaron grinned without looking up from the laptop. You're welcome. Moments like that became normal between them. Easy. Comfortable. Dangerous. Because somewhere between late-night grocery runs and quiet mornings sharing coffee in the kitchen, Nick started realizing he liked hearing Aaron laugh more than he should. He liked the way Aaron absent-mindedly pushed his hair back while concentrating on sketches, liked how excited he got explaining design ideas nobody else probably listened to long enough to understand, liked the fact that Aaron always waited awake upstairs when Nick worked late downstairs alone. And Aaron clearly wasn't unaffected either. Nick noticed it in small things first. The way Aaron watched him while thinking Nick wasn't paying attention. The way his face softened whenever Nick smiled unexpectedly. The fact that Aaron started wearing Nick's old gray hoodie around the apartment because it's warmer, even though it hung loose around his frame. Then came the snowstorm. The weather warning started early that afternoon, but Boston ignored storms the same way it always did until things became dangerous. By evening the roads were buried under thick snow and the city started shutting down section by section. Nick was halfway through closing the garage when the power suddenly died. Everything went dark except for the weak emergency lights near the office. Seriously, Nick muttered. Aaron came downstairs holding his phone flashlight. The whole block lost power. Perfect timing. The heater upstairs stopped working almost immediately. Within an hour the apartment felt freezing, so Nick dragged an old portable heater into the garage office where the insulation held warmth better. That was how they ended up sitting together on the office floor around midnight wrapped in blankets while snow slammed violently against the garage doors outside. Aaron sat closer than usual because of the cold. Nick tried very hard not to think about it. For a while they talked about random things. Bad professors, impossible customers, favorite movies, childhood memories. The conversation flowed easier than ever before, probably because the storm made the outside world feel far away for once. Then Aaron got quiet. Nick glanced over. What? Aaron stared down at his hands. Can I ask you something? Depends. Why are you still alone? Nick blinked once. That's personal. I know. Aaron hesitated slightly. You don't have to answer. Nick leaned back against the filing cabinet behind him, debating whether to shut the conversation down completely. But something about the dim lighting, the storm outside, and Aaron sitting there wrapped in his blanket made honesty feel easier than usual. My last relationship ended a long time ago, he finally said. After my brother died, I stopped being easy to live with. Aaron looked up slowly. Nick shrugged. I worked too much, got angry too easily, shut everybody out. Eventually people stopped trying. That's not true. Nick gave him a look. You barely know me. I know enough. The way Aaron said it made something tighten painfully in Nick's chest. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Aaron quietly admitted, I think people only like the version of me that's useful to them. Nick frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Aaron laughed softly, but there was sadness underneath it. My family already planned my career before I finished college. My internships, my future apartment, even who I'm supposed to spend time with. Everything's about connections and image and expectations. He looked down again. Nobody asks what I actually want. Nick studied him carefully. For the first time since meeting him, Aaron looked genuinely tired instead of simply stressed. You know what's weird? Aaron continued quietly. Living here is probably the poorest I've ever been, but it's also the calmest I've ever felt. Nick's heartbeat suddenly felt too loud inside the tiny office. Aaron looked over at him then, eyes soft in the dim emergency lighting. When I'm here, he admitted carefully, I don't feel like I have to pretend all the time. Something shifted between them at that moment. Something obvious and impossible to ignore anymore. Nick should have looked away. Instead, he found himself staring at Aaron's mouth. Aaron noticed immediately. The air changed. Neither moved at first. Then Aaron whispered, almost nervously, Nick, that was enough. Nick reached up slowly, giving Aaron every chance to pull away, but the younger man didn't move. If anything, he leaned closer. The kiss happened softly at first, careful, hesitant, but the second Aaron kissed him back. Something inside Nick cracked open. Warmth rushed through his chest so suddenly it almost hurt. Aaron's hand tightened slightly against Nick's hoodie, while snow crashed violently outside the garage. And for a few seconds the entire world disappeared except for the feeling of finally touching someone he'd already started caring about far too much. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke. Aaron looked stunned. Nick probably looked worse. Then reality returned all at once. Aaron immediately shifted back slightly, breathing unevenly. I'm sorry. Nick frowned. For what? I shouldn't have. Aaron stopped himself, visibly panicking now. This is complicated. Nick felt the warmth drain from the moment almost instantly. Complicated how? Aaron opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he stood up too quickly. I should go upstairs. Aaron. But the younger man was already walking away. Nick spent the rest of the night awake in the garage office staring at the dying heater while his thoughts spiraled completely out of control. The next morning things felt painfully awkward. Aaron avoided eye contact during breakfast and disappeared to campus earlier than usual. Nick hated how disappointed that made him feel. By late afternoon, the frustration finally became unbearable. Nick was fixing a transmission downstairs when the office television suddenly switched to a breaking local news segment. Hayes Hotel's executive family attends annual charity gala. Nick barely paid attention at first until a familiar face appeared on screen. Aaron. Except not the Aaron living above his garage. This version wore a fitted black suit worth more than Nick's monthly income, standing beside two elegant, wealthy-looking people while cameras flashed around them. The caption underneath read, Aaron Hayes, son of real estate developer Jonathan Hayes. Nick slowly lowered the wrench in his hand. Suddenly everything made sense. The expensive watch, the polished manners, the family pressure, the constant secret phone calls. The garage office felt strangely quiet. At that exact moment, the front door opened upstairs. Aaron had come home. Nick didn't say anything that evening. That was somehow worse than anger. Aaron noticed it immediately the second he walked into the apartment above the garage. Nick barely looked at him while making coffee, his jaw tight, shoulders tense beneath his dark sweatshirt. The television was off, the repaired radio played softly in the background, and the silence between them suddenly felt heavy in a way it never had before. Aaron slowly placed his backpack near the couch. "You saw it." Nick let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Yeah." For a few seconds, neither moved. Then Nick finally turned around. "You couldn't tell me?" Aaron looked exhausted already, like he'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. "I wanted to. But..." Aaron rubbed both hands over his face. "I knew you'd look at me differently." Nick laughed once under his breath, but there wasn't any humor in it. "You mean finding out you're basically rich enough to buy this entire building? It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" The frustration in Nick's voice hit harder than yelling would have. Aaron stepped closer carefully. "My family has money, yes, but I'm not hiding some secret double life, Nick. I'm still the same person." Nick looked away immediately, and that reaction hurt more than Aaron expected. Because deep down, Nick already did see him differently now. The next few days became tense in ways neither knew how to fix. Nick wasn't cruel. He wasn't cold either. That somehow made everything worse. He still made coffee for Aaron in the mornings, still asked if he'd eaten dinner, still waited up when Aaron came home late from campus. But there was distance in every interaction now, something guarded settling behind Nick's eyes. And Aaron hated it. One night, he finally snapped while Nick worked underneath an old Mustang downstairs. "You're doing it again." Nick slid out from beneath the car slowly. "Doing what?" "Pretending everything's fine when it's obviously not." Nick wiped grease from his hands with an old rag. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to stop treating me like I lied about who I am." Nick stared at him for several seconds before answering quietly, "You did lie." The words landed hard. Aaron swallowed. "I just didn't tell you my parents were wealthy. You let me think you were barely surviving." "I am surviving," Aaron said sharply. "You think money magically fixes everything?" Nick immediately regretted the argument the second he saw the look on Aaron's face. But frustration had already taken over. "No," Nick muttered. "I just think people like you always have somewhere better to go eventually." Silence. Complete silence. Aaron looked like he'd been slapped. "What does that mean?" Nick realized too late how bad the sentence sounded. But the truth was already out now. "It means," Nick said tiredly, "this place was always temporary for you." Aaron stared at him for a long moment, hurt slowly spreading across his face. "So that's what you think of me?" Nick looked away first. That was answer enough. Aaron nodded once slowly, grabbed his coat from the chair beside the kitchen, and walked out without another word. The apartment suddenly felt freezing after the door slammed shut. Nick cursed under his breath immediately. He wanted to go after him. Instead, he stayed downstairs working until nearly 2 in the morning because fixing engines felt easier than fixing whatever was happening between them. But when Nick finally came upstairs, Aaron still wasn't home. That uneasy feeling in his chest got worse around 3 a.m. By 4, Nick finally grabbed his jacket and went looking. Boston was brutally cold that night, wind whipping through nearly empty streets, while snow covered sidewalks in dirty gray ice. Nick checked the late-night diner near campus first, then the library, then the small coffee shop Aaron liked studying at. Nothing. He finally found him sitting alone outside the subway station 3 blocks away from the garage. Aaron looked miserable. His hands were red from cold despite being shoved deep inside his pockets, and his eyes immediately shifted away when he saw Nick approach. "You trying to freeze to death?" Nick muttered. Aaron laughed softly without humor. "Maybe." Nick sat beside him anyway. For several minutes, they listened silently to distant traffic while snow drifted through the streetlights. Then Aaron spoke quietly. "You know what hurts the most?" Nick stayed silent. "I wasn't scared when you found out my family was rich." Aaron swallowed hard. I was scared you'd think I didn't really care about this place or about you. Nick finally looked over. Aaron's eyes were wet now, but he kept talking anyway. You think I stayed because this was some fun little rebellion? He asked quietly. Nick, I stayed because this is the happiest I've felt in years. Something inside Nick twisted painfully. Aaron let out a shaky breath. I know I grew up differently from you. I know my life probably sounds ridiculous sometimes. But when I'm with you, I don't feel like somebody's project anymore. His voice cracked slightly. I just feel normal. Nick looked down at his hands. Because the truth was ugly and embarrassingly simple. He believed Aaron. That was the problem. Nick had already started needing him too much. And people Nick needed always left eventually. My brother used to say the same thing, Nick admitted quietly after a long silence. That one day life would finally calm down and stay good. He laughed softly to himself. Then he died before 27. Aaron turned toward him slowly. Nick rubbed his jaw tiredly. Ever since then, every time something in my life starts feeling too important, he stopped himself. I guess I start waiting for it to disappear. The anger drained out of Aaron's expression almost instantly. For the first time, he understood. Nick wasn't pushing him away because of money. He was terrified. Aaron shifted closer carefully. I'm still here. Nick looked at him then, really looked at him, and something inside his chest finally gave out. Before he could second-guess himself, he grabbed Aaron's face and kissed him hard. Not careful this time. Not hesitant. Months of tension crashed into the moment all at once. Aaron made a quiet sound against his mouth and immediately kissed him back just as desperately, fingers gripping tightly into Nick's jacket while cold wind whipped around them outside the empty station. Everything they'd both been holding back finally spilled out at once. Fear, loneliness, want, relief. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing unevenly, Aaron rested his forehead briefly against Nick's shoulder. I hate you sometimes, he whispered weakly. Nick actually laughed for the first time all week. Yeah. You make me feel things I wasn't planning to feel. Nick's hand slid carefully through Aaron's hair. Pretty sure you ruined my life first. That should have been the moment things finally got better. Instead it became the beginning of everything falling apart. 3 days later, Jonathan Hayes arrived in Boston. Nick met him unexpectedly when a black luxury SUV stopped outside the garage one afternoon. A tall silver-haired man stepped out wearing an expensive dark coat that probably cost more than Nick's truck. He looked exactly like Aaron around the eyes. You must be Nick Walker, the man said calmly. Nick already hated him immediately. Jonathan glanced around the garage briefly before speaking again. My son talks about you often. Nick crossed his arms. That's supposed to mean something? It means, Jonathan replied evenly. I'd prefer to have an adult conversation before this situation becomes more complicated. The word situation instantly irritated Nick. Aaron came downstairs halfway through the conversation and immediately froze. Dad. Jonathan's expression softened slightly when he looked at his son. Your mother's worried about you. I'm fine. You disappeared for months. I moved out, Aaron corrected sharply. That's different. The tension between them filled the entire garage. Jonathan finally sighed quietly. Aaron, your graduate placement in New York starts in 2 months. You cannot throw away your future over. He glanced briefly toward Nick. A temporary situation. Nick felt the insult immediately. Aaron did too. This isn't temporary. Jonathan looked genuinely unconvinced. That hurt more somehow. After he left, the apartment upstairs felt emotionally wrecked. Aaron barely spoke through dinner. Nick knew why. Because deep down, the fear had already started growing again. Different worlds. Different futures, different lives. And no matter how much they cared about each other now, reality was slowly forcing its way between them. The apartment above the garage became painfully quiet after Jonathan Hayes left Boston. Not immediately. At first, both Nick and Aaron tried pretending nothing had changed. They still cooked dinner together, still shared coffee in the mornings, still sat side by side on the couch at night, while the repaired radio played softly in the background. But something heavy had settled between them now, an invisible countdown neither wanted to acknowledge out loud. 2 months. That was all they had before Aaron's graduate placement in New York began. Nick hated how often he thought about it. He hated noticing the calendar every morning. Hated catching himself imagining the apartment without Aaron's sketchbooks scattered across the kitchen table or his half-finished coffee cups sitting beside the sink. Worst of all, he hated realizing how deeply woven Aaron had become into every part of his life. Because losing him now would destroy him. And Nick wasn't sure he could survive losing someone like that again. Aaron felt it too. Nick could see it every time Aaron looked at him when he thought Nick wasn't paying attention. Like he was already trying to memorize everything. The sound of tools clanking downstairs. The way Nick rolled his sleeves while working. The stupid habit he had of falling asleep on the couch with the television still running. Neither of them knew how to stop the future from coming. Then things got worse. One Friday afternoon, Nick received a call from his landlord. The lease for the garage wouldn't be renewed next year. Nick sat frozen inside the office while the older man awkwardly explained that a property investment company had offered significantly more money for the building. Luxury redevelopment. New apartments. Better business opportunity. Nick knew exactly what that meant. People like him always lost against people with money. By the time he hung up, his hands were shaking with frustration. Aaron found him sitting silently behind the front desk 30 minutes later. What happened? Nick tossed the paperwork toward him bitterly. We're done here. Aaron quickly read through the notice, his expression darkening immediately. They're replacing the garage? Whole block probably. Nick laughed humorlessly. Guess Boston needs more overpriced apartments nobody can afford. Aaron looked furious now. This can't be legal. It is when rich people want something. The sentence slipped out harsher than Nick intended. Aaron flinched slightly anyway. Nick instantly regretted it. But the damage was already there. That night they argued for the first time in weeks. Not screaming. Somehow worse than that. Quiet exhaustion. Aaron stood near the kitchen counter while Nick paced restlessly through the apartment. You think my family did this? Nick stopped moving. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Nick rubbed both hands over his face. Aaron. People like your father buy buildings like this without thinking twice. My father doesn't even know who owns this property. Nick laughed bitterly. Exactly. The silence afterward felt awful. Aaron looked down at the floor for several seconds before speaking quietly. You keep acting like I belong with them instead of here. Nick's chest tightened painfully. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Nick opened his mouth but nothing came out. Because the truth sounded pathetic even inside his own head. He was scared. Scared Aaron would eventually realize this life wasn't enough. Scared New York would remind him who he used to be. Scared one day Aaron would wake up beside him and understand he could do better than a mechanic barely holding his life together. Aaron stared at him for a long moment before whispering quietly. You still don't believe I'd stay. Nick looked away immediately. And once again that silence became an answer. Aaron nodded slowly like something inside him had finally broken. I think I need some space. The sentence hit harder than Nick expected. Aaron. I can't keep begging you to believe me. Nick watched helplessly as Aaron grabbed his coat and left the apartment. This time he didn't come back that night. Or the next one. 3 days passed. 3 miserable, empty days. Nick barely slept. He worked longer hours just to avoid going upstairs because the apartment felt unbearable without Aaron in it. Every room carried traces of him. His hoodie hanging near the couch. Design papers spread across the kitchen table. The coffee mug he always used still sitting beside the sink. Nick finally realized something terrifying during those 3 days. The apartment didn't feel like home anymore without him. On the 4th night, Nick found Aaron's sketchbook sitting beside the radio. He hadn't touched it before because it felt too personal, but loneliness finally won. Slowly, Nick opened it. Page after page showed sketches of him. Nick laughing while covered in grease. Nick asleep at the kitchen table. Nick carrying groceries upstairs. Nick fixing engines beneath hanging lights inside the garage. Then the drawings changed. The newer pages weren't simple sketches anymore. They were plans. Detailed redesign concepts for the garage. Expanded workspace. New branding. A renovated apartment upstairs. Large windows. A combined studio and repair shop. At the bottom of one page Aaron had written quietly in pencil. For us. Nick stopped breathing for a second. He turned another page. There, folded carefully between the paper, was a handwritten letter. Nick, I think part of me knew from the beginning this would hurt eventually. You spent so long convincing yourself that everyone leaves that now you push people away before they get the chance. But I need you to understand something. I never stayed because I was running from my life. I stayed because when I'm with you, I actually like the person I become. You make me feel calm, safe, real. And honestly, I think I fell in love with you long before I meant to. I know our worlds are different. Maybe they always will be. But none of that has ever mattered to me as much as you do. I just wish for once it mattered to you too. Aaron. Nick sat alone in the apartment for almost an hour after finishing the letter. Then finally he stood up, grabbed his jacket, and left. The next morning, Aaron stood nervously inside a massive exhibition hall in New York City, surrounded by professors, designers, and wealthy investors attending the graduate showcase for his program. Normally, this should have been one of the biggest moments of his life. Instead, he felt empty. People congratulated him on his presentation while he smiled automatically through every conversation. His parents stood nearby speaking proudly to faculty members, but Aaron barely heard any of it. Because none of it felt important anymore. Not without Nick. Aaron had just finished another exhausting conversation with investors when he heard a familiar voice behind him. You make these. His heart stopped. Aaron turned around so fast he nearly dropped his drink. Nick stood there wearing dark jeans, an old black coat, and the same exhausted expression Aaron had missed every second for the past 4 days. For a moment neither moved. Then Aaron crossed the room almost instantly. You came. Nick looked nervous for maybe the first time since they'd met. Took me long enough. Aaron laughed weakly while tears immediately filled his eyes. You're an idiot. Yeah, Nick admitted quietly. Probably. The crowded room around them disappeared completely. Nick stepped closer carefully. I read your sketchbook. Aaron looked horrified. Oh my God. And the letter. Nick. No, let me say this first. Nick swallowed hard. You were right. Aaron stared at him silently. Nick rubbed one hand nervously against the back of his neck before continuing. My whole life, everybody I loved either left or got taken away from me. After my brother died, I guess I convinced myself it was safer not to need people too much. His voice lowered slightly. But then you showed up. Aaron's eyes were already wet now. Nick took another step closer. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being your apartment too. He smiled faintly. It became ours. Aaron actually broke at that sentence, covering his face briefly while laughing through tears. Nick gently pulled his hands down. I'm scared all the time with you, he admitted honestly. But losing you scares me more. For several seconds Aaron just stared at him like he couldn't fully believe what he was hearing. Then he kissed him. Right there in the middle of the crowded exhibition hall. Soft at first. Then emotional enough that Nick forgot entirely about the people surrounding them. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing unevenly. Somewhere nearby, Aaron heard his mother gasp softly in shock. Neither cared. Jonathan Hayes approached several minutes later expecting tension. Instead he found his son smiling brighter than he had in years. The older man looked between them quietly before sighing under his breath. I still think this relationship makes your life more complicated, he admitted honestly. Aaron immediately tensed. But Jonathan continued. However, he glanced at Nick briefly. You look happier than you ever did back home. The sentence surprised all three of them. Jonathan looked exhausted suddenly, older somehow. I spent so many years trying to build the perfect future for you, he said quietly to Aaron. Maybe I forgot to ask what kind of life you actually wanted. Aaron's expression softened immediately. The reconciliation wasn't dramatic or perfect. That made it feel real. 6 months later, Nick and Aaron reopened the garage together after securing a small business loan and community funding campaign helped massively by Aaron's design work online. The renovated garage became half repair shop, half industrial design studio. Upstairs, the apartment looked completely different now. Plants near the windows, warm lighting, music constantly playing from the repaired radio, sketchbooks and coffee mugs covering nearly every surface. It looked lived in. It looked loved. Then one rainy spring night, almost exactly 1 year after Aaron first knocked on the garage door, Nick brought him up to the rooftop again. Boston glowed beneath them while rain fell softly across the city lights. Aaron smiled immediately. "You're being suspiciously romantic right now." Nick rolled his eyes. "Shut up for a second." Then he pulled a small silver ring from his pocket. Aaron froze completely. Nick suddenly looked nervous again. "I had this whole speech planned earlier." Aaron was already crying. "Yeah, well," Nick muttered softly, smiling helplessly at him. "Guess I only really need one thing." He stepped closer. "Stay." Aaron laughed through tears and kissed him before Nick could even officially ask. And under the rain above the garage that brought them together, with music drifting softly upstairs through the open apartment window, both of them finally understood something simple and life-changing. Home had never been a place. It had always been each other. And sometimes, the people who change our lives forever don't arrive with grand promises or perfect timing. Sometimes they simply knock on our door during the worst season of our lives and quietly become home. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for more heartfelt stories.